the headline question is consensus in international climate change talks the way to save the planet? We've got a UNFCCC process in which nothing is agreed pretty well until everything is agreed. There has to be a global consensus, and we are making extraordinarily slow process, some people think, towards a global deal, with what's on offer after Durban, a deal by 2015, which won't become fully in force, won't come fully into force until 2020. How optimistic are you of a meaningful global deal in 2015? 1, very optimistic. 5, very pessimistic. Your voting starts now. 71% pessimistic or very pessimistic, and only 12% optimistic or very optimistic. So that is a rather dramatic finding, that you all think it's really important and you think it's not going to happen. We've left the revolvers on the table outside. We have a total of 7 presentations, each of which will be really short, of a specific idea. And we have 4 judges.
I'm going to start with the premise. The premise is that any negotiation, whether it be climate or otherwise, that is based on sharing out of burden, cost or pain is doomed to fail. Imagine
Mark Kember went first and talked about the need to reframe the whole debate in a positive way, to offer wins to people and to create coalitions of those who would bid upwards, not downwards.
They want. And the interesting thing about lots of, for example, clean energy resources is that they are much better secured together than separately. So there is a natural incentive for people to look for shared benefits, for example, through expanded grids or networks that link up countries, countries that have lots of sun working with countries that have lots of water, that countries that have lots of wind, etc., to create that framework. And you inscribe those commitments which bid upwards in a register. Now, if you get 2 or 3 of these, as the agriculture one, the forest one, and REDD Plus at the moment is not a bad example of how that might work, then from that there are a series of common elements that you might include in a framework, which might include monitoring and verification, for example, to help people share expertise, information and understanding to help further build up those commitments.
But, I mean, don't we at the same time, besides looking at the things we've got to do new, don't we also need to look at things we've got to stop doing or do differently? And, I mean, is this really going to deal with the sort of vested interest issues that have held back progress in so many areas?
Because we're talking about stopping things that people don't like or don't want to stop, we immediately run into a brick wall. But if we start by looking at the things that everybody does want, then we create positive momentum. And one of the problems with the negotiations has been one of trust, but particularly one of confidence. People say we want this, that or the other, but they don't really believe that we can have solar energy and wind power and whatever it is to fuel the world's needs. So what we're doing is starting from what we have got, demonstrating that it works, and then building up the confidence which will enable us to overcome those challenges which may appear more difficult because of vested interest.
Now let's think in a different way. What will happen if we will have a new coalition of all countries in all different groups that want a high ambition outcome with a rise to the top?
Jose said, you know, unanimity is perverse, but also the groups we've got are not able to deliver the deal we need because they are actually themselves too diverse and not giving us the opportunity to make alliances. For example, he said, of people who want a really ambitious outcome. And so we should enable that to happen and put a little bit of pressure on the people who don't want an ambitious outcome to be drawn into that process.
This will create markets, scale, and business opportunities. At a tipping point, parties will end up losing by not joining up in terms of market share in a new economy. Considering the numbers, it is not impossible for the many small to end up moving the few large.
How quickly do you think the big emitters like China and India and the US, how quickly will they join the coalition of the hopeful?
I am not pretending them to join. I'm pretending them to force to join, which is a different thing. That's what happened in Durban. They were not for joining. They had to join because people forced them to do so. Now we have to have that sort of approach, because if you start thinking that, as you said, everything will be agreed when everybody's in agreement, well, it's not because everybody wants to, it's because they need to do so. And how do you do this? Because a big chunk of the majority of the world is moving in a certain direction. And then China and the US will have to say, well, everybody's moving, so if we don't move, we lose. We'll have to join up.
My proposition is basically quite simple, which is that the 2 things that you need in order to move to a lower carbon, people-friendly world is carbon pricing in the economies that are the major generators of climate pollution, and you also need climate legislation.
Farhana made a really important point about how change happens. And she said that you can put people in a room and negotiate, but unless there is some sense of outside pressure on the negotiations through social movements, and particularly around issues of pricing of carbon and domestic legislation, then there will not be progress. And so we should find ways to encourage social movements.
Even in the UK, where we have the benefit of climate legislation, it's very new still, but the rest of the planet, you will need to ensure that the nascent demand for cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner energy systems goes hand in hand with low carbon development. And I think that will only happen when you get social movements, NGOs and others to really tackle the vested powers in those countries and in the global system as a whole.
How do you think civil society can effectively influence government decision?
In developing countries, it must be part and parcel of very different struggles, and we have yet to unite the climate movement in a way that can really assert the kind of pressure that we need. Otherwise, we are, walking into an incremental. Is still useful, is still relevant, but it isn't really going to change the time frame in which global peaking occurs, for example, and we'll only do that in a completely different way.
I think in order to save the planet from human destruction, it would be a mistake to focus only on the climate change negotiations, because there are other fora and legal entry points. Just to mention a few.
Christoph said, the negotiations are fine, but actually there are other fora and there are legal instruments we could use in order to deliver change. And he cited the case of Palau, but also looked at the International Law Commission. We can use legal processes and existing legal treaties in order to drive change, or existing legal instruments at least.
So I think with a bit of creative legal interpretation, there might be other entry points, and it might be possible for the international community to use other fora that are less polarized and less complex than the UNFCCC.
I'd like to probe the timescale here. I mean, can we really expect your solution to accelerate things, or is there a real risk that it will slow the process down?
I'm fairly optimistic that nothing can slow us down any further.
I propose that more attention should be given to the possibilities of voting within the UNFCCC, at least on sub-items. This is likely to greatly speed up decision-making and to shift the attention and the negotiation dynamics away from the spoilers. And spoilers we have in the UNFCCC.
Louise made a proposal that we should introduce voting, perhaps using the model of qualified majority voting as in the EU. The idea of breaking down the opportunity of rogue states almost to block negotiations was something that she was very focused on.
Of course, without having consent of the big emitters, a state cannot be obliged to pay or to implement costly mitigation policies. Nevertheless, minorities should not be able to prevent majorities from international cooperation in climate change.
You've already acknowledged that in reality we cannot outvote big countries who might have to take, expensive or significant action at home. So isn't this really a proposition to make the process a little bit more efficient, rather than something that would really transform the ambition of what countries are prepared to do?
Well, I think at least it rules out small states that act as a spoiler, as they do now. So it will not overcome the big divide in interest between China and the US and the big players. But at least it avoids Sudan, but also the OPEC countries perhaps to continue, to drag the process.
The main argument is that I think to be effective, climate policy has to be rooted, anchored in national policy. There's a simple reason for that. Mitigation on a global scale is going to be costly, and that cost will have to be borne up front. The benefits of any climate mitigation action will be long-term, distant, and highly uncertain. And so in this scenario, states if they are to commit to this kind of action, need two things in place. One is a strong domestic consensus on moving forward, on mitigation, and B, at least a significant amount of business support for taking such action.
Robert said, yes, the international negotiations are fine and we should continue, but do you know what? If we don't have national policy as the basis of creating movement, then the international negotiations take place in some kind of separate universe and don't make much progress and don't relate back to the real world. So he was strongly in favour of finding coalitions that would develop national policy, national legislation with business and civil society support.
But ultimately, we need to reframe climate change so that it works in different national contexts. Climate change is about energy independence for some, it's about moral duty for others, and it's about green growth for others. And that's where the argument lies. Thank you very much.
Can the UNFCCC or any multilateral process at the moment really claim to be aimed at fostering consensus? And if they do, crucially, the question is whose consensus? Because I'm pretty sure the 7 billion people in the world are not all wearing navy blue power suits.
And finally, Bridget made a couple of points. One was that we absolutely had to change the guys in blue suits problem with the delegations and make them more diverse, particularly by bringing in more women, but also make sure that civil society advocates had a seat at the table and were properly represented. And both of those should be funded through training and so on.
At present, there are countries where the evidence is very clear that women and youth and other communities of marginalization are not only going to be the most impacted by climate change, but have the solutions and the perspectives necessary to find out how we can combat climate change. And those countries are being represented by delegations of up to 20 men with no women and no youth. Do we really expect this demographic alone to transform business as usual?
I fully agree of the situation of the civil society engagement in our process is very limited and needs to be enhanced by many means. But a question to you is more, isn't it the case that the real work of the civil society is really during the rest of the year, and in those 2 weeks, yes, it's important, but it's not a crucial moment for action. So being member of a delegation is important, but it's not really the core activity, while, you know, at home, at the country level, and so on.
We have not seen true reform in how the process actually works, and I think there's a huge dichotomy between let's build social momentum and then let's go into a closed-door negotiation and not let that all of these fantastic and diverse ideas that could be solutions come into that process in any way. And I think we absolutely need to spend some time figuring out how to make civil society and these social movements influence the process. I don't think they're separate things. They have to be each other. They have to meet each other, because even Rio is an example. If you have millions of people collaborating and coordinating socially around these issues, but yet the actual process, they have no mechanism for really influencing, you disenfranchise that movement completely.
I said earlier on a number of times, these are not mutually exclusive solutions. They're all elements of a solution. I think the big message that we take away from this whole discussion is that those who are responsible for managing the climate negotiations, and I look particularly at Daniele and Pete and Seth in this context, those of you who are responsible for delivering need some help from us, because if we don't get something moving, you're going to get stuck arguing about the agenda and who chairs what committee from now until kingdom come.
We now have a lack of trust in the process among the groups of countries, and Copenhagen was a watershed in that respect. We should be looking at ways of restoring trust.
I think, first of all, it's clear that the government will not be able to make it alone. We in 2015, so we need to build this momentum and the bottom-up direction to push government to reach this agreement. But I think also we have to be really optimistic, because it's possible. It's the future. There is no way back. And I think this is the example we heard today are all pretty much good ones. And it's a matter of making them happen, actually, and move forward and not discussing how much time will take, but let's do it.